Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Go ahead and grab your historian hats, because today we are uncovering the visual and philosophical birth of European nationalism in the 19th century. We're going to dive right into how a continent totally ruled by sprawling empires and absolute monarchs transformed, almost entirely, into the map of nation-states we recognize today.
Here is our roadmap for today. First, Sorrieu's dream of 1848. Second, decoding the utopian vision. Third, rise of the nation-state. Fourth, Ernst Renan and the nation. And finally, number 5, the daily plebiscite. Let's jump right in.
Section 1. Sorrieu's Dream of 1848, A Vision of Republics.
Okay, let's begin our historical inquiry in the pivotal year of 1848. This was a time of massive, continental, revolutionary upheaval. What is truly fascinating here is the sheer scale of the artist's imagination. Notice how French artist Frédéric Sorrieu visualizes his dream of a world made of democratic and social republics through this incredible, sweeping procession of men and women. You've got people of all ages and social classes marching in this long train, offering homage to the Statue of Liberty. And if you look really closely at Liberty, she bears the torch of enlightenment in one hand and the Charter of the Rights of Man in the other. It's a hugely powerful statement of what the people were marching towards.
Moving on to Section 2. Decoding the Utopian Vision, Symbols of a New Order.
To really decode this masterpiece, we have to understand the opposing political forces it represents. You see, Sorrieu wasn't just painting a pretty picture here. He was making a radical political manifesto against the status quo. Let's define what the people in 1848 were actually rebelling against. Absolutism. Think of an absolutist government kind of like a game. Actually, scratch that, it's more like a rigged game, where one single player holds literally all the power and makes all the rules, and totally forbids anyone else from arguing or changing how the game is played. Historically, this refers to monarchical governments that were highly centralized, heavily militarized, and deeply, deeply repressive.
And you can see exactly what Sorrieu thinks of that system right here. Look closely down at the foreground of the print. The artist has quite literally smashed the crowns, scepters, and symbols of these absolutist monarchies into shattered remains scattered right on the earth. It is a striking visual destruction of the old repressive order to make way for the new.
But we do have to view this artwork through the right lens. Sorrieu's grouping of people into neat, distinct nations with their own flags is a utopian vision. Much like a perfectly photoshopped picture today, it represents a flawless ideal rather than the very messy reality of 1848 Europe. A utopian society is one so perfect that it's highly unlikely to ever actually exist. Let's look at how he organizes this perfect world.
So, who is leading this massive parade? Well, chronologically and politically, the placement in this march matters immensely. The United States and Switzerland are leading the procession out front, because by 1848, they were already established nation-states. Following right behind them is France, who you can identify by the revolutionary tricolor flag, having just reached the Statue of Liberty. And right behind France are the German peoples. Now, historically, this is absolutely fascinating. In 1848, Germany did not yet exist as a united nation. No way! They were just a collection of numerous German-speaking principalities. So that black, red, and gold flag they carry, it represents their liberal hopes to unify under a democratic constitution.
Following Germany, we see a truly pan-European vision. We've got the peoples of Austria, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, Lombardy, Poland, England, Ireland, Hungary, and Russia. And above it all, as this massive, diverse train marches past, Sorrieu uses the gaze of Christ, saints, and angels from the heavens to powerfully symbolize a newfound fraternity among the world's peoples. The heavens themselves are essentially blessing this massive transition to democratic nationhood.
Section 3. Rise of the Nation-State, Decline of Empires.
As we step out of this utopian artwork and into the actual reality of the 19th century, we witness the sweeping decline of those multinational dynastic empires that had dominated Europe for centuries. During this era, a massive shift occurred, and it is absolutely crucial to distinguish between a modern state and a nation-state. A modern state had been developing in Europe for a long time. It's simply like a company managed by a powerful CEO. A centralized power exercising control over a specific territory. But the newly emerging nation-state? That was entirely different. It was much more like a family business. A nation-state was one where the majority of its citizens, not just the rulers, developed a profound sense of common identity and shared history. And this commonness didn't just exist from the beginning of time, it was actively forged through struggles and the everyday actions of the common people.
Which leads us directly to Section 4, Ernst Renan and the Nation. What is a nation?
Fast forward a bit to 1882, a few decades after Sorrieu's painting. French philosopher Ernst Renan delivers a highly influential lecture at the University of Sorbonne to formally define this new reality. In his lecture, titled What is a Nation?, Renan fundamentally challenged the basic assumptions of his time. Many people back then, and honestly even today, assume that a nation is simply a group of people who speak the same language, belong to the same race or religion, or just happen to occupy the same territory. Well, Renan completely criticized this. He argued that just sharing a language or living on the same plot of land does not automatically make a group of people a nation. There has to be something much deeper.
Renan famously stated that a nation is the culmination of a long past of endeavors, sacrifice, and devotion. He uses this brilliant analogy of social capital. Think of it exactly like a long-standing sports team. It's not just about wearing the same uniform or happening to live in the same city as the stadium. It's about honoring past heroic victories, remembering the great figures of the past, and sharing a deep, ongoing commitment to the team's legacy. You need a common will in the present to have performed great deeds together and to wish to perform still more in the future.
And that brings us to Section 5, the daily plebiscite, a shared commitment.
Renan introduces a specific, very famous mechanic for how this shared commitment is maintained day after day. But to understand his next profound point, we first need to define a plebiscite. Simply put, a plebiscite is a direct, democratic vote by which all the inhabitants of a region are asked to accept or reject a proposal. It's the ultimate, direct expression of the people's will.
So take that concept and apply it to a nation. Renan drops this incredible line, calling a nation a daily plebiscite. By doing this, he beautifully illustrates that large-scale solidarity requires an ongoing daily choice. A nation isn't a static thing, right? It exists because its people wake up every single day and implicitly vote to stay together. Furthermore, Renan argues that the existence of nations is an absolute necessity. Why? Well, because they serve as the ultimate shield against global tyranny. Think about it. If the world had only one law and only one master, like those absolutist empires of the past, liberty would be totally lost. Nations, with their distinct identities and shared social capital, guarantee that liberty actually survives.
Which brings us to the end of our historical journey today. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you to ponder this final question directly from our primary text. Based on everything we've uncovered today, from Sorrieu's shattered crowns in 1848 all the way to Renan's daily plebiscite in 1882, what truly makes a nation? Is it just arbitrary lines drawn on a map? Or is it a shared spiritual principle? And why is the survival of this daily plebiscite so incredibly vital to our own modern liberty?
Let's put on our historian hats for a second, because we are diving into an explainer of some seriously fascinating and volatile source material today. We're looking closely at the primary texts and the timeline of the French Revolution and the birth of European nationalism. It's a wild story, really, a mix of absolute monarchs, radical revolutionaries, and the sudden rise of a massive empire.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Spark of the revolution. 2. Forging a collective identity. 3. Exporting the revolution. 4. The Napoleonic Code. 5. Liberators turned oppressors. And finally, 6. Redrawing the map. Let's get right into it.
Our next topic is the spark of the revolution. It's 1789, and honestly, the world is just about to change forever.
Now, to really grasp the sheer scale of what we're talking about, we need to anchor ourselves in this timeline. Everything kicks off, as you know, in 1789 with the French Revolution itself. Then, by the 1790s, French armies are actively moving out across Europe. Fast forward to 1804, and a massive legal shift happens when the Civil Code is introduced. Things eventually go south for the French at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, which all culminates in the Congress of Vienna in 1815. So that's the exact chronological sequence we're going to be unpacking today.
Right, so let's look at what actually went down in 1789. Before this, France was a full-fledged territorial state completely under the thumb of an absolute monarch. But the political and constitutional changes of the revolution, they caused this massive transfer of sovereignty. Think of it kind of like a giant employee buyout. Imagine a really rigid, autocratic corporation that suddenly gets bought out by its workers. So instead of one untouchable CEO holding all the cards, the workers now share equal rights and get to decide the destiny of the company. That's what happened here. The revolution proclaimed that the people would, from then on, constitute the nation.
Section 2. Forging a collective identity. Because tearing down a monarchy was really only half the battle. Next, these revolutionaries had to figure out how to actively engineer a unified identity out of a deeply fractured population.
From day one, they started introducing practices to build a sense of collective identity. And their most powerful tools were these two concepts: la patrie, meaning the fatherland, and les citoyens, meaning the citizen. This was a completely profound psychological shift. It's like moving from being just a tenant on some wealthy landlord's sprawling property to suddenly realizing you're a co-owner of a shared inherited estate. You aren't just subjects anymore, you're an equal community enjoying equal rights under a single constitution.
And look at how systematically they pulled this off. To stamp out regional differences, they swapped the old royal standard for a brand new French flag, the tricolor. The old elitist Estates General, that was elected by a body of active citizens and totally rebranded as the National Assembly. They rolled out a highly centralized administration, created uniform laws for everybody, adopted standard weights and measures, and completely abolished all internal customs duties. They even discouraged regional dialects so that the French spoken in Paris became the common language for the entire nation. They were literally building a nation from scratch.
Section 3. Exporting the Revolution. Once they had consolidated this new identity at home, the revolutionaries made a pretty bold declaration. Their ultimate mission was to liberate the rest of Europe from despotism.
And this perfectly captures how that message landed abroad. This is the cover of a German almanac from 1798, created by a German Jacobin named Andreas Riebaum. Just look at the striking visual parallel he drew here. On the left side, you've got the famous storming of the French Bastille by the revolutionary crowd. And then right next to it, on the right, there's a very similar fortress representing despotic rule in the German province of Kassel. The slogan accompanying it says it all: the people must seize their own freedom. It's a primary source that shows exactly how French ideology was lighting a fire in neighboring lands.
So as news of all this reached different European cities, students and the educated middle classes started setting up their own Jacobin clubs, and their campaigns essentially rolled out the red carpet. They paved the way for the French armies, which started pushing into Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, and huge chunks of Italy in the 1790s. The philosophical spark had officially become a full-blown military campaign, exporting the idea of nationalism across borders.
Moving to Section 4, the Napoleonic Code. Now, this brings us to a massive turning point and a really fascinating historical paradox, which is the rise of Napoleon. See, Napoleon basically destroyed democracy in France by bringing back a monarchy. But administratively, he was incredibly revolutionary.
The defining year for this huge administrative overhaul is 1804. That is the exact year the Civil Code, usually called the Napoleonic Code, was introduced. And this document was an absolute masterpiece of rationalization. Think about it like a computer network. Before 1804, Europe was running on this super fractured, totally incompatible network of localized feudal laws, random weights, and mixed-up currencies. Napoleon basically wiped the hard drives and installed one universal operating system. He established equality before the law, locked in property rights, and just completely abolished the feudal system, meaning peasants were finally free from serfdom and manorial dues. In the towns, he scrapped those restrictive guild systems and massively upgraded transport and communication. For businessmen and small-scale producers, this meant they could finally seamlessly trade goods. It was a total game changer.
Section 5. Liberators turned oppressors. Now, you'd probably think the rest of Europe was thrilled about all this efficiency, right? Well, initially, in places like Brussels, Mainz, Milan, and Warsaw, the French armies were actually welcomed as harbingers of liberty. But man, that enthusiasm did not last long.
Let's dig into these incredible primary sources to see why the mood soured so fast. Take a look at the top image here. This is a color print by German painter Karl Caspar Fritz, depicting the occupation of Zweibrücken. See those French soldiers in the blue, white, and red? They are definitely not liberating anyone. They're acting like straight-up oppressors. On the left, they're seizing a peasant's cart. In the center, they're harassing young women, and they're literally forcing a peasant to his knees. And the plaque on that Tree of Liberty has a super sarcastic German inscription that translates to, "Take freedom and equality from us, the model of humanity." Okay, now look at the bottom image. This is a brilliant satirical piece showing Napoleon as a postman after he lost the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. As he trudges back to France, he's dropping letters out of his bag, and every single letter has the name of a territory he just lost. The so-called liberator had seriously overplayed his hand.
To really understand why the European public was so outraged, we have to weigh Napoleon's conquests. On one side of the scale, you have this undeniable administrative brilliance, the 1804 Civil Code, standardized laws, common currency. But on the other side, a really brutal political reality. The local populations quickly realized that all this administrative efficiency didn't go hand in hand with actual political freedom. They were hit with increased taxation, heavy censorship, and honestly the worst part, forced conscription into the French armies just so Napoleon could conquer more of Europe. The costs just completely outweighed the benefits. It is a timeless historical lesson, really. Populations will reject efficiency in a heartbeat if it costs them their basic freedoms.
Section 6. Redrawing the map. Ultimately, stretching the French military too thin, combined with all that fierce local resistance, caused Napoleon's empire to collapse, and that forced a massive geopolitical shift.
This map illustrates the fallout perfectly. This is Europe right after the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The great powers of Europe essentially got together to hit the undo button on the massive changes sparked by the French Revolution and Napoleon. Look at how they redrew the borders around France. They carefully set up these buffer states, like the Kingdom of the Netherlands up north, and handing Prussia new territories on its western edge, all to balance power and make sure France couldn't expand like that again. The grand experiment of exporting the revolution was over. In its place, a complex, conservative order took over, desperately trying to restore stability to the continent.
Which leaves us with a really profound paradox to think about. This entire era we just explored in our sources was driven by a desperate desire for liberty, yet it somehow birthed a massive empire. So I have to ask you this. If Napoleon destroyed democracy at home in order to enforce administrative equality across a whole continent, was he the French Revolution's savior or its executioner? It's an absolutely fascinating historical debate. Keep questioning these sources, think about what this means for how we view power today, and I'll catch you next time.
Our next topic is the making of nationalism in Europe. So let's put on our historian hats and really investigate this intense ideological tug-of-war that literally transformed the map of the world. We're going to look closely at how modern nations weren't just drawn up, but were forged out of the fires of revolution, economic necessity, and, well, sheer willpower. Here's our agenda for today's explainer. Europe before nation-states, the rise of liberal nationalism, the economic push for unity, 1815 and the new conservatism, and finally, the underground revolutionaries. Okay, let's dive right into this by tracing the pendulum swing of power across these eras. We're going to anchor our historical investigation with these crucial mile markers. Spanning over a century, we'll trace how the initial spark of the Napoleonic Wars back in 1797 eventually ignited the monumental unifications of modern nations like Italy and Germany by the 1870s. Keep these dates in mind. They're the stepping stones of our journey today. Section 1. Europe before nation-states, the patchwork empires. If you looked at a map of mid-18th century Europe, you wouldn't find Germany, Italy, or Switzerland as we know them today. No way. Instead, you'd find this chaotic web of kingdoms, duchies, and autocratic monarchies. A perfect example of this is the Habsburg Empire, which ruled over Austria-Hungary. Think of it like a mismatched patchwork quilt that was just hastily sewn together. It was incredibly diverse. You had German-speaking Alpine regions living right alongside Italian-speaking provinces like Lombardy and Venetia. In Hungary, half the population spoke Magyar, while the other half spoke various dialects. Over in Galicia, the aristocracy actually spoke Polish. And all around them lived subject peasant peoples, Bohemians, Slovaks, Croats. These diverse multilingual groups shared absolutely no collective identity, no common culture. The only fragile thread binding this entire patchwork together was a required allegiance to the emperor. Philosophically, there was no nation here, only a ruler and his subjects. Section 2. The rise of liberal nationalism, a shift in power. But as the winds of industrialization swept across the continent, beginning in England and slowly moving east, that old world order really began to fracture. For centuries, a powerful landed aristocracy absolutely dominated Europe. They were a tiny numerical group, but man, they owned the vast countryside estates and the townhouses. They spoke French for diplomacy and their families were tightly knit together by marriage ties. But the pendulum began to swing. Industrialization birthed a new middle class, a rapidly growing population of industrialists, businessmen, and educated professionals. And they looked at this old system of aristocratic privilege, a system based entirely on birth, and they demanded a totally new way of governing. They philosophically challenged the old world, arguing that society should actually be based on merit and market value, not just aristocratic birthright. This educated middle class rallied behind a powerful new ideology, liberalism. Now, the word itself derives from the Latin root liber, which simply means free. They wanted to transition society from a system where subjects blindly obeyed a monarch to something more like a social contract. They emphasized freedom for the individual, equality of all before the law, and the radical, game-changing concept of government by the consent of the governed. Essentially, they wanted a constitution and a representative government through a parliament. However, as historians, we always have to look at the fine print. It's a crucial point that this liberal ideal of equality before the law did not mean universal suffrage or the right to vote for everyone. Far from it. Under the Napoleonic Code, women were actually reduced to the status of a minor, subject entirely to the authority of fathers and husbands. Furthermore, men without property, entirely excluded from political rights. Political power was still treated as this highly exclusive club for property-owning men. It was, without a doubt, the glaring blind spot of early 19th century liberal ideology. Moving on to Section 3, the economic push for unity, breaking the barriers. Beyond just political freedom, this emerging commercial middle class recognized a pretty harsh reality. True power required economic freedom. They desperately needed to abolish state-imposed restrictions on the movement of goods and capital. To really understand their frustration, think about the number 39. Napoleon had left behind a German confederation of 39 separate, distinct states. And get this, each of those 39 states possessed its own currency and its own completely different weights and measures. If a merchant in 1833 was traveling from Hamburg to Nuremberg to sell goods, he had to pass through 11 different customs barriers, paying a 5% duty at each and every one. Imagine the nightmare of calculating textile lengths. The measure of cloth, called an L, was different everywhere you went. In Frankfurt, an L got you 54.7 centimeters of cloth, but in Nuremberg, it was 65.6. It was an absolute obstacle course to economic growth. To solve this total nightmare, a customs union called the Zollverein was formed in 1834, initiated by Prussia. Think of it like finally removing all the toll booths on a massive unified highway, just to allow the unhindered movement of goods, people, and capital. They abolished tariff barriers and slashed the number of currencies from over 30 down to just 2. Add to that the creation of a vast network of railways stimulating mobility, and suddenly the German states were deeply economically intertwined. And this brilliantly illustrates a really profound historical concept. Economic measures were basically the Trojan horse for national unity. As professor of economics Friedrich List noted perfectly back in 1834, the aim of the Zollverein was to bind the Germans economically into a nation. A free economic system, protecting its interests externally and stimulating productivity internally, was quite literally the best tool to awaken a unified national feeling. Section 4, 1815 and the New Conservatism. The pendulum swings back. History is rarely a straight line of progress, right? Following the pivotal defeat of Napoleon in 1815, European governments were seized by a massive spirit of conservatism, and the aristocratic elites violently yanked that pendulum right back. The conservatives believed that established, traditional institutions like the monarchy, the church, and social hierarchies had to be preserved at all costs. But here's the really fascinating part of their playbook. Rather than just returning entirely to the pre-revolutionary past, they hit the rewind button, but they kept the new engine. They realized that the modernizations initiated by Napoleon, like a dynamic economy, the abolition of feudalism, and especially a modern army and an efficient bureaucracy, could actually make their traditional autocratic monarchies even stronger and way more effective. So, in 1815, the major powers who defeated Napoleon, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, met at the Congress of Vienna to literally redraw the map of Europe. Hosted by the powerful Austrian Chancellor, Duke Metternich, their main objective was to undo Napoleon's changes and prevent any future French expansion. Look how they carved things up. The conservative Bourbon dynasty was restored to power in France. To box France in, Prussia was given important new Western territories. Austria took control of northern Italy, and Russia was handed part of Poland. They expertly engineered a conservative order of buffer states to just lock down the continent. Now, what's incredibly interesting here is the visual evidence of just how deeply oppressive these new autocratic regimes were. Take a really close look at this primary source. It's an anonymous caricature from around 1820 called The Club of Thinkers, and it's an incredible piece of historical satire. Look specifically at the faces of the intellectuals sitting around that table. They literally have muzzles strapped to their mouths. Notice how there are 8 distinguished men, likely professors or writers, gathered around for a discussion, yet they are perfectly silenced by these restrictive devices. This artistic flair represented a very dark reality. The conservative regime set up in 1815 simply did not tolerate criticism. They imposed strict censorship laws to control exactly what was said in newspapers, books, and plays. If you read the board on the right side of that caricature we just looked at, rule number 1 literally states, "Silence is the first commandment of this learned society." Making matters worse, the plaque on the wall asks, "How long will thinking be allowed to us?" Under Metternich's conservative order, asking for liberty wasn't just frowned upon, it was a highly dangerous, radical inquiry. Which brings us to Section 5, the underground revolutionaries, the resistance. As any historian will tell you, when you criminalize thinking and muzzle society, you don't destroy the demand for liberty. Nope, you merely drive it underground, into the shadows. During the years following 1815, the paralyzing fear of repression drove liberal nationalists entirely out of public sight. Secret societies sprang up throughout the European states with a highly unified, incredibly dangerous agenda. Their goal was to train revolutionaries, spread ideas of liberty, and completely oppose the monarchical forms established by the Vienna Congress. Most importantly, they saw the creation of unified nation-states not just as some political goal, but as the absolute essential basis for human freedom. Let's look at this fascinating historical print to see how this builds in a very real human way. The intense figure standing here is the Italian revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini. Born in 1805, he was so deeply dedicated to the cause that he was actually sent into exile at just 26 years old for attempting a revolution. This print captures him secretly founding the underground society Young Europe in Bern back in 1833. Look at the handshake at the bottom, symbolizing their secret pact, and the serious, clandestine nature of the figures gathered there in the dim light. Mazzini believed with his whole heart that God had intended nations to be the natural units of mankind. Italy, he argued, could absolutely not remain a patchwork of small states. It had to be forged into a single, unified republic. Mazzini's relentless vision of a unified, democratic republic absolutely terrified the conservative elite. In fact, his actions were so effective and his ideology so compelling that the very architect of the Congress of Vienna, Austrian Chancellor Duke Metternich himself, labeled Mazzini as the most dangerous enemy of our social order. It was the ultimate clash of ideologies, the aristocratic desire for rigid preservation versus the explosive, youthful demand for national self-determination. As we bring this explainer to a close, we have to look back at the chaotic patchwork, the economic struggles, and the heavy hand of conservative censorship and ask ourselves a vital question. Did the brutal censorship and border manipulations of the old aristocratic empires actually stop the march toward national identity? Or did stropping muzzles onto the thinkers of 1815 simply guarantee that the modern nation-state would inevitably be born through the fires of underground revolution? It's a fascinating paradox to consider as we trace the lines of the modern map. Keep thinking on that, and as always, keep exploring history.
You know, as a historian, there are certain eras that just absolutely crackle with energy. Periods where the old rules are completely thrown out the window and the entire map of the world is violently redrawn. Well, we are jumping right into one of those explosive periods today. We're exploring the Age of Revolutions, specifically that intense window between 1830 and 1848. This was a time when the conservative powers of Europe tried desperately to hold on to their absolute control, only to find themselves staring down a massive tidal wave of liberalism and nationalism. Let's dive right in and see how this all unfolded.
Our next topic is the 1830 upheavals.
So this was an incredibly turbulent era. You have liberal nationalist elites, and we're primarily talking about the educated middle class here, right? Professors, school teachers, clerks, commercial businessmen. They began to actively dismantle the conservative regimes that had a literal chokehold across Europe. If we trace the spark of this revolution chronologically, we really have to start in France. Back in 1815, a conservative reaction had restored the old Bourbon kings to power. But the people weren't having it. By July 1830, liberal revolutionaries violently overthrew that Bourbon monarchy and installed a constitutional monarchy with Louis Philippe in charge. And here's why this is absolutely crucial. That July Revolution triggered an immediate domino effect. By August of 1830, an uprising sparked in Brussels, which literally broke Belgium away from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. The map was already changing.
Now, this entire phenomenon is captured perfectly by a famous and honestly brilliant observation from the Austrian Chancellor, Duke Metternich. He said, "When France sneezes, the rest of Europe catches cold." It's just a perfect way to illustrate how highly contagious French political turbulence was at the time. Once that absolute monarch fell in Paris, The fever of revolution just completely infected the rest of the continent.
Okay, let's look at another early spark, the Greek War of Independence. Greece had actually been swallowed up by the Ottoman Empire way back in the 15th century. But fueled by this sudden growth of revolutionary nationalism, their struggle for independence exploded in 1821. Nationalists got massive support from Greeks living in exile and, crucially, from West Europeans who deeply romanticized ancient Greek culture. It wasn't just professional soldiers out there either. The famous English poet Lord Byron actually organized fund and went out to fight, tragically dying of a fever there in 1824. But ultimately, this combined cultural and military push culminated in the Treaty of Constantinople in 1832, officially recognizing Greece as a fully independent nation.
Our next topic is Romanticism and national feeling.
We're shifting our focus now from physical battlefields to the cultural battlegrounds of art, poetry, and music. Because nationalism didn't just grow from wars and expanding territory, culture played an incredibly powerful role in creating the very idea of a nation. Let's do a quick visual forensic analysis of this massive masterpiece by the French painter Eugène Delacroix. This is The Massacre at Chios from 1824. Notice how Delacroix dramatizes this horrific incident where 20,000 Greeks were reportedly killed by Turks. He completely ignores military tactics. Instead, he uses these vivid, striking colors and focuses deeply on the visible suffering of women and children in the foreground. He is actively bypassing cold reason and appealing directly to our emotions to manufacture sympathy. This right here is Romanticism in action, rejecting science and reason in favor of pure emotion and intuition.
To understand the philosophical side of this shift, we have to look at the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder. He popularized the concepts of das Volk, meaning the common people, and Volksgeist, the spirit of the nation. Think of his philosophy kind of like a family's secret recipe or a shared heirloom passed down through generations. He argued that true culture wasn't found up in the royal courts. It was an organic identity built by common people through folk songs, poetry, and village dances. This was a direct philosophical challenge to those artificial borders drawn by kings.
And this brilliantly illustrates how culture directly fueled politics. Take the Grimm brothers. We all know them for their fairy tales, right? First published in 1812 after they spent years traveling from village to village. But they weren't just collecting stories for children. They considered these folk tales to be expressions of a pure German spirit. They became highly active in liberal politics and eventually published a massive 33-volume dictionary of the German language. Why? Because language was a vital tool to oppose French cultural dominance and forge a unified, authentic German national identity.
We can see how this exact type of cultural resistance builds in Poland, where language literally became both a cultural shield and a sword. At the end of the 18th century, Poland was partitioned and effectively vanished from the map. When Russia occupied the territory, the Russian language was brutally imposed everywhere, and Polish was forced completely out of schools. But after an armed rebellion was crushed in 1831, Polish clergy struck back culturally. They defiantly used Polish for all church gatherings and religious instruction. It became a weapon of national resistance. The cost, though, was incredibly high. Massive numbers of priests and bishops were thrown in jail or exiled to Siberia by Russian authorities simply for refusing to preach in Russian.
Our next topic is hunger, hardship, and popular revolt.
Now, while the middle class was busy debating philosophy, the common people were facing a desperate economic struggle that ultimately fueled the raw, physical spirit of rebellion. The first half of the 19th century, particularly the 1830s, brought immense, crushing hardship. Just look at these compounding factors. An enormous population spike across Europe meant there were far more job seekers than actual jobs. Desperate people migrated from rural areas into incredibly overcrowded city slums. Meanwhile, small-town producers, especially textile weavers working from home, were totally devastated by a flood of cheap, machine-made goods imported from a rapidly industrializing England. Add in a year of bad harvests, skyrocketing food prices, and peasants still suffocating under heavy feudal dues, and you essentially have a continental powder keg of poverty.
And the tragically predictable outcome of all that pressure is depicted right here in this striking illustration of a peasant's uprising. By the year 1848, the pressure cooker exploded. Severe food shortages and massive unemployment brought the desperate, starving population of Paris out into the streets. Barricades were erected, absolute chaos reigned, and King Louis Philippe was literally forced to flee the country. A national assembly had to quickly step in, proclaim a republic, and desperately set up national workshops just to provide basic employment.
Our next topic is the Silesian Weavers' Uprising.
To really grasp the ground-level desperation of this era, we need to look at a specific, devastating event from 1845 that highlighted the extreme exploitation of the working class. The core of this tragedy is captured perfectly by the journalist Wilhelm Wolff, who observed a Silesian village of 18,000 inhabitants back in 1845. Cotton weaving was their absolute lifeline, but Wolff noted how contractors, the guys who supplied raw materials and ordered the finished textiles, ruthlessly slashed their payments. They knew the workers were desperate and starving, and they actively took advantage of that misery to artificially increase their own profit margins. Mapping out the specific events of June 4th chronologically shows exactly how fast things unraveled. Right around 2 p.m., a large crowd of these weavers marched in pairs to their contractor's mansion, simply demanding fair wages. Instead of a negotiation, they were met with absolute scorn and threats. And the starving crowd just snapped. They forced their way inside, violently smashing elegant windows and porcelain furniture, and literally tore the storehouse's cloth supplies to shreds. The contractor fled with his family, but he returned 24 hours later, having requisitioned the military. In the tragic exchange that followed, the army shot 11 weavers dead. It's a stark, heartbreaking reminder of the brutal reality of the era.
Our next topic is 1848, the Revolution of the Liberals.
So while the poor and unemployed were revolting in the streets, the educated middle class saw a golden opportunity. They capitalized on this widespread unrest to push their own structured political agendas. Parallel to the starving peasants, these middle-class professionals were organizing. In February 1848 in France, their pressure helped force the monarch to abdicate, leading to a republic based on universal male suffrage. Seeing this success, liberals in fragmented regions like Germany, Italy, Poland, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire combined their demands. They brilliantly used the chaotic popular unrest to push for unified nation-states built on strict parliamentary principles, specifically demanding a formal constitution, freedom of the press, and the freedom of association.
Take a really close look at the historical detail hidden within this contemporary color print of the Frankfurt Parliament, convened in the Church of St. Paul. The architecture is grand for sure, but direct your attention to the upper left gallery. You'll notice women standing up there. Women had formed political associations, founded newspapers, and actively protested right alongside the men. Yet they were strictly relegated to mere observers in the visitors' gallery, while 831 elected male representatives convened below to decide the fate of the entire nation. It visually perfectly captures the limits of liberalism at the time.
The Frankfurt Parliament's grand attempt to unify Germany ultimately failed step by step. On May 18, 1848, those 831 representatives marched festively into the church. They actually successfully drafted a constitution for a unified Germany under a constitutional monarchy. But when they offered the crown to Friedrich Wilhelm IV, the King of Prussia, he outright rejected it. He refused to be bound by a parliament and joined other monarchs to crush the assembly. And because the middle-class deputies dominating the parliament stubbornly resisted the demands of the workers and artisans, they lost their vital popular support. Without the masses defending them, military troops were simply called in and the assembly was violently disbanded.
Our next topic is women's rights and the aftermath.
We really need to focus on the deep ideological clash regarding gender equality that sharply divided the liberal movement itself during this age of revolution. As we saw in the Frankfurt Church, despite their massive contributions, women were universally denied suffrage rights. This blatant hypocrisy led to the sharp rise of feminist awareness. Now, feminism in this specific historical context is defined as the awareness of women's rights and interests based on the fundamental belief in the true social, economic, and political equality of the genders. They weren't just asking for a vote, they were demanding full recognition as equal human beings.
As impartial historians, we have to look at both sides of this intense 1848 ideological divide through the primary sources. On one hand, we have Karl Welcker, an elected liberal politician in the Frankfurt Parliament. He argued that nature created men to be strong protectors and providers, while openly labeling women as weaker, dependent, and timid, suited only for the home. Against this, we have feminist activist Louise Otto Peters, who fiercely dismantled that logic. She argued a profoundly simple philosophical point: liberty is indivisible. Basically, you cannot claim a society is fighting for freedom if half of its humanity remains deliberately unfree.
Although conservative forces ultimately suppressed the 1848 liberal movements, the old order could never be fully restored. The autocratic monarchs finally realized that these relentless cycles of revolution and repression would only end if they actually granted concessions to the liberal nationalists. So, post-1848, some pretty profound changes were introduced. Serfdom and bonded labor were officially abolished both in the Habsburg dominions and in Russia, and by 1867, the Habsburg rulers even compromised to grant much greater autonomy to the Hungarians. Which leaves us with a fascinating final historical question to consider as we wrap up this explainer. Look at the changes granted after all that bloodshed. Did the Age of Revolution actually achieve its grand goals of total liberty and unified nations? Or did the old, cunning conservative powers simply figure out how to compromise just enough, bending in the wind, so to speak, so they wouldn't break, thereby maintaining their ultimate grip on power? It's a debate historians are still having today, and definitely something for you to think about. Our next topic is the making of Germany and Italy. You know, if we look really closely at the landscape of 19th century Europe, we see this absolutely fascinating, profound shift in how nations were actually built. Early on, the dream of a nation-state was totally fueled by democratic revolutions and liberal ideals, right? People were out there demanding constitutions and parliaments. But as we move past that revolutionary year of 1848, well, those idealistic dreams hit a cold, hard reality. The blueprints for modern nation-states weren't ultimately drawn up by democratic assemblies. No, they were forged by the architects of power. We're talking conservative monarchs, cunning diplomats, and the sheer blunt force of modern militaries. So in this explainer, we're going to put on our historian hats and peel back the layers of romanticized history to see exactly how these modern states were engineered.
So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to dive into 3 distinct historical case studies. First up, the German architect. Then, proclaiming the German Empire. After that, assembling the Italian puzzle, followed by Garibaldi and the boot. And finally, we'll look at the strange British case and forging a new British nation.
Section 1. The German Architect. Blood and Iron. We're about to see exactly how military dominance entirely replaced those liberal ideals right in the heart of Europe.
Now, to really grasp this era, we have to understand a massive philosophical shift that took place right after 1848. Think of nationalism as a powerful, high-speed vehicle. Prior to 1848, this vehicle was being driven by liberal middle-class revolutionaries. They wanted to unite the different regions of the German Confederation into a single nation-state governed by an elected parliament. But that liberal initiative was completely crushed. It got repressed by the combined forces of the monarchy, the military, and the large landowners of Prussia, who were known as the Junkers. So what happened next? Well, the conservatives essentially hijacked the vehicle of nationalism. They figured out that instead of fighting against nationalist sentiments, they could actually mobilize them to promote their own state power and achieve political domination over Europe. It was the exact same vehicle, but the drivers and their ultimate destinations had completely changed.
And historical artifacts brilliantly illustrate exactly who took the wheel. When we examine the map of Prussian expansion alongside this famous 1870 caricature from a Vienna publication called Figaro, we see the true dynamic at play. That towering figure right there, that's Otto von Bismarck. He was the chief minister of Prussia, and really the undeniable mastermind architect of German unification. Notice how he's depicted in the Reichstag, the parliament? He's not calmly debating in there. He is literally wielding a whip over the elected deputies. The artist is conveying a super clear interpretation of democratic processes under Bismarck. They simply bent to his will. Because Bismarck didn't build Germany through votes or democratic consensus. He pulled it off using the immense power of the Prussian army and its highly disciplined bureaucracy. He was a conservative who just used the language of nationalism to conquer and absorb the surrounding states piece by piece.
Let's trace how this builds historically. We start with the failure of that liberal middle-class attempt in 1848. From that point on, Prussia takes absolute leadership of the movement. And Bismarck's strategy was incredibly calculated and, honestly, ruthless. Over a period of just 7 years, he orchestrated 3 distinct wars against Austria, Denmark, and finally France. Each and every war ended in a Prussian victory, systematically knocking out rivals and expanding Prussian territory, which completed the process of unification. It was a conquest, plain and simple, culminating in January of 1871.
Section 2. Proclaiming the German Empire, a cold reality. Let's look at the exact moment this massive new superpower was officially born. Now, what's really fascinating about this painting is the sheer atmosphere captured by the artist Anton von Werner. This is the morning of January 18, 1871. It was a bitterly cold day, and this assembly was held in the unheated Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, which, by the way, was in defeated France. Talk about a massive power move. Look at who is actually in the room. This isn't a gathering of everyday citizens or elected officials. It's an assembly of the princes of the German states, representatives of the army, and key Prussian ministers. Right at the center stands Kaiser William I of Prussia, and near him the architect himself, Bismarck, alongside the chief commander of the Prussian army,
General von Roon. This monumental work perfectly captures the dominance of Prussian state power. Germany was quite literally born in a military uniform, and this new state immediately placed a huge emphasis on modernizing the currency, banking, legal, and judicial systems. Basically, Prussian measures and practices became the strict model for the rest of this newly forged Germany.
Section 3. Assembling the Italian Puzzle, Elite Diplomacy and Rebellion. So, if Germany was built with a hammer, Italy was put together like a complex, multi-layered puzzle that required some very different sets of hands.
Much like Germany, Italy had a really long history of political fragmentation. Italians were scattered all over several dynastic states, not to mention the multinational Habsburg Empire. So unifying it took a few different ideological approaches. During the 1830s, we have Giuseppe Mazzini. He was the idealist. He put together a coherent program for a unitary Italian republic, and even formed a secret society called Young Italy. But his revolutionary uprisings in 1831 and 1848 completely failed. The mantle then fell to the only Italian princely house, Sardinia-Piedmont, and its ruler, King Victor Emmanuel II. His chief minister, Cavour, took charge. Now, Cavour was neither a revolutionary nor a democrat. He was an elite who actually spoke French way better than he spoke Italian. But through an incredibly tactful diplomatic alliance with France in 1859, Cavour managed to defeat the Austrian forces in the north. Then the whole strategy flips from elite diplomacy to grassroots rebellion. In 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi joined the fray, marching right into South Italy. By 1861, the puzzle pieces finally snapped together, and Victor Emmanuel II was proclaimed king of a united Italy.
The contrast between these two maps visually proves the sheer scale of the puzzle Cavour and Garibaldi actually had to solve. Looking at Italy before unification in 1858, it's completely divided into 7 distinct states. The north was under the Austrian Habsburgs, the center was ruled by the Pope, and the southern regions were under the domination of the Bourbon kings of Spain. Literally only one state, Sardinia-Piedmont, was actually ruled by an Italian. Even the Italian language hadn't acquired one common form yet. Now contrast that with the map showing Italy after unification. By unifying these regions, the ruling elites of Sardinia-Piedmont saw the possibility of massive economic development and political dominance. It was a staggering territorial achievement.
Section 4. Garibaldi and the Boot, the Peasant Rebellion. We need to look a bit closer at the grassroots, almost chaotic military campaign that physically secured the southern half of the peninsula. This 1859 English caricature is absolutely fascinating. It shows Garibaldi literally holding on to the base of a boot, which is shaped exactly like the map of Italy, of course, so that King Victor Emmanuel II can slide his leg into it from the top. Garibaldi is perhaps the most celebrated of all the Italian freedom fighters. He led his famous Expedition of the Thousand down to South Italy, where his volunteers just kept swelling in numbers until they had about 30,000 men. They were popularly known as the Red Shirts, and they succeeded in winning the support of the local peasants to drive out the Spanish rulers. But get this, here is a staggering, slightly ironic historical fact. Much of that peasant population was highly illiterate. They had literally never even heard of liberal nationalist ideology. The peasant masses who supported Garibaldi in southern Italy had never even heard the word Italia. They actually believed that L'Italia was King Victor Emmanuel's wife. They fought an entire war of unification without even conceptualizing the nation they were fighting for.
Section 5. The Strange British Case, Assimilation and Suppression. Here, we're going to find a completely different blueprint for building a nation-state.
Some scholars argue that Great Britain is the ultimate model of the nation-state, but its formation was radically different from what we just saw. In Germany and Italy, unification was the result of sudden upheaval, revolution, and intense localized wars over just a few decades. Great Britain, however, was forged through a really long, drawn-out process. Actually, it's probably more accurate to think of the British unification method not as a sudden revolution, but as a slow, calculating, centuries-long hostile corporate takeover by a dominant entity, carefully assimilating and suppressing its neighbors over generations.
To understand this takeover, we first have to understand that prior to the 18th century, there was absolutely no British nation. The primary identities of the people living in the British Isles were purely ethnic. And by ethnic, we mean identities based on a common cultural origin or background, specifically the English, the Welsh, the Scot, and the Irish. Every single one of these ethnic groups had their own distinct cultural and political traditions. But as the English nation steadily grew in wealth, importance, and sheer power, it systematically used that leverage to extend its influence over the other nations of the islands.
Let's trace this prolonged timeline to see exactly how this takeover unfolded.
The main instrument of this change was the English Parliament. They had seized power from the monarchy way back in 1688 after a really protracted conflict. So, with a solid, parliament-driven state centered in England, they started making their moves. In 1707, they passed the Act of Union between England and Scotland, which resulted in the United Kingdom of Great Britain. In practical terms, this just meant England could now legally impose its influence on Scotland. And Ireland suffered a similar, but honestly even more tragic fate. The English actively helped the Protestants of Ireland establish dominance over what was a largely Catholic country, heavily suppressing Catholic revolts. After a failed revolt led by Wolfe Tone and his United Irishmen in 1798, Ireland was forcibly incorporated into the United Kingdom in 1801.
Section 6. Forging a new British nation, imposing identity. Because once the territory was taken, the old identities had to be erased.
A new British nation definitely didn't happen naturally. It was actively forged through the aggressive propagation of a dominant English culture. The symbols of this new Britain, things like the Union Jack flag, the national anthem God Save Our Noble King, and the English language itself, were actively promoted across all the islands. Meanwhile, the distinct cultures of the integrated regions were systematically suppressed. For instance, the Catholic clans in the Scottish Highlands suffered terrible repression whenever they tried to assert their independence. They were legally forbidden to speak their native Gaelic language or even wear their national dress, and large numbers of them were forcibly driven entirely out of their homeland. The older nations survived, sure, but only as subordinate partners in this new union. It was unification by cultural erasure.
And this brings us to a really crucial realization as we wrap up this explainer. Looking back at the iron will of Bismarck, the strategic maneuvering down in Italy, and the cultural suppression by the English, we are left with a pretty powerful question. Are modern nations truly born from the shared democratic ideals of their people, or are they simply the successful branding of whichever dominant power managed to seize control? Just think about the map of the world today and consider the architects who actually drew those lines. It certainly makes you view the history of state building in an entirely new light, doesn't it? Keep exploring and never stop questioning the history behind the borders.
Our next topic is the allegorical vision of the German nation. So go ahead and put on your historian's hat because we are stepping straight into the archives. You know, back in the 19th century, Germany wasn't the unified country we know today. It was actually this fragmented, complicated patchwork of completely separate states. So how do you bring all those different people together? Well, today, we're going to dive deep into how this nation essentially dreamt itself into existence using the sheer power of art and symbolism. We'll be looking really closely at how profound philosophical ideologies and massive historical turmoil were literally painted onto canvases and sketched into everyday political documents. Okay, let's start by looking at the evidence. We have this absolutely fascinating primary source document, and it acts as a visual map of a nation's shifting ideologies. Seriously, it has everything we need right here to decode the intense political climate of the mid-19th century German states. We've got a cipher for deciphering specific symbols, a masterful rendering of liberal nationalism, and then a really somber historical illustration that tells a story of profound defeat. So let's dive right into this and unlock what these 19th century artists were really trying to tell us. Now to really grasp what's going on, you have to understand the concept of an allegory. The best way to think about an allegory is kind of like a comic book superhero. Every single part of a superhero's costume represents a specific superpower or a core trait, right? Like a shield represents defense, or a lasso might represent truth. Well, in this case, the female figure of Germania was created as a physical embodiment of the German nation. She didn't exist as a real person. Rather, she was a blank canvas. Literally every item she wore or weapon she carried was carefully chosen by artists to represent the heavy, abstract political concepts that the German people were wrestling with at the time. This breakdown right here, this is our ultimate decoder ring. And what's truly fascinating is just how specific this visual language gets. If an artist paints Germania with broken chains, they are broadcasting a crystal clear message about being freed, true emancipation from oppression. That breastplate adorned with an eagle, that projects the raw strength of the German Empire. The crown of oak leaves isn't just some random fashion choice. The German oak specifically stands for heroism. If she's holding a sword, it signals a readiness to fight. But, and this is a great little nuance, if there's an olive branch wrapped around that sword, it signals a willingness to make peace. And those rays of the rising sun in the background, the optimistic beginning of a brand new era. So, let's see how all these attributes actually come together in practice. When we look at this potent combined image of liberal nationalism, we can literally read the artwork like a book using that decoder ring we just talked about. Front and center, we see the breastplate with the double-headed eagle, projecting immense strength.
Resting right across it is the sword, wrapped with the olive branch, which tells us that while they are armed and ready, they strongly desire peace. Tucked just behind that is the crown of oak leaves, waiting to crown a hero. And down at the bottom left, resting quietly, is the broken chain of freedom. It's just a total masterpiece of political communication.
And you can't miss the black, red, and gold tricolor flag proudly displayed right alongside all those items. This was the banner of the liberal nationalists in 1848. And get this, it was a symbol so threatening that it was actually banned by the dukes of the German states. The year 1848 is massive here. This was the Spring of Nations, a time when revolutions were just sweeping across Europe like wildfire. In the German regions, the middle classes, professionals, and artisans were demanding a unified nation-state governed by a constitution, instead of that patchwork of monarchies. They even convened the Frankfurt Parliament to try and draft a constitution for a unified German nation. That black, red, and gold flag became the ultimate visual shorthand for this democratic dream. Simply flying it was an act of absolute, unapologetic defiance against the conservative establishment.
Now, here is a crucial historical clue left behind by an artist named Veit. Back in 1836, he placed the Kaiser's crown, which is a massive symbol of monarchical submission, exactly in the same spot where he later placed a broken chain, representing ultimate emancipation. I mean, this is a historian's goldmine. It shows us in real time how the philosophical ideology of the entire nation was shifting. In 1836, the vision for Germany was still heavily centered around a Kaiser, an emperor. The crown was everything. But as revolutionary fervor grew leading up to 1848, that symbol of bowing to a single ruler was literally swapped out for the broken chains of liberty. The people didn't want a master anymore. They wanted freedom.
Map this out with me for a second. We're looking at a rapid era of turmoil, moving from submission in 1836 to the revolutionary hopes of 1848, straight into a tragic collapse just 2 years later in 1850. It perfectly encapsulates the emotional and political whiplash of the era. The optimism of 1848, where they truly believed they could finally unite Germany under a liberal constitution, it was incredibly short-lived. The conservative forces, the monarchy, the military, the aristocracy, they pushed back fiercely. That Frankfurt Parliament they worked so hard to set up was ultimately disbanded, and the revolution failed. Which brings us to the visual aftermath.
Let's see how that historical tragedy translates into the artwork of the time. This piece by Julius Hübner from 1850 is practically a historical crime scene. It's actually titled The Fallen Germania, and wow, the contrast between the optimistic cluster of symbols we looked at just a minute ago and this bleak, devastating illustration couldn't be starker. We are no longer looking at an empowered rising hero, we are looking at the grim, harsh reality of a completely crushed rebellion. If we go back and read the visual clues we learned earlier, it's obvious. Germania's superpowers are gone. Just look closely at her posture. She is exhausted, she's mourning, completely stripped of her vitality. She still wears the breastplate of the German Empire, but her other attributes, the sword representing readiness to fight and the crown of oak leaves representing heroism, they are literally cast aside into the dirt. And that rising sun of a new era, it's nowhere to be seen in this desolate landscape. Instead, the sky is just heavy, dark, and oppressive.
The text leaves us with this really critical investigative question, asking us to connect the crushing visual defeat in Hübner's 1850 painting to the historical failure of the 1848 liberal nationalist revolution. And as historians, we can answer this clearly now. Hübner is painting the death of the 1848 dream. Remember when the Frankfurt Parliament offered the crown of a unified Germany to the King of Prussia? Well, he flat out rejected it, because the offer came from the people rather than by divine right. Once he did that, the liberal nationalist movement completely collapsed. Germania has fallen because the hope of a unified democratic Germany was, at least for the moment, absolutely shattered by conservative monarchical forces holding desperately onto absolute power.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's that these images were never just art, they were the political heartbeat of an era. They encoded the deepest hopes and the darkest failures of an entire people. As we close out this explainer, I want you to consider how the symbols on our own modern flags, our monuments, and even today's political cartoons continue this 19th century tradition of hiding massive, complex ideologies right in plain sight. From national eagles to the specific colors on our banners, the visual language of nations is still speaking to us today, if we only know how to read it. So keep your historian's hat handy and start decoding the world around you.
Our next topic is nationalism and imperialism. So, step back with me, if you will, into the late 19th century. Europe is literally vibrating with change right now. We've spent some time looking at how the idea of a nation originally brought people together. But, as we hit that final quarter of the 1800s, the narrative takes a pretty dark, dramatic turn. As your historian and guide through this era, I'm going to show you exactly how a concept that was genuinely meant to liberate people ultimately became the very fuel that set the whole world on fire. Okay, let's just dive right into this. Section 1, the shift in nationalism. Let's look at how this definition changed. So we really need to understand how the definition of a nation drastically shifted during this time frame. Think of the first half of the 19th century kind of like a neighborhood coming together to govern itself, right? It was idealistic. It was all about liberal democratic sentiments, kicking out the monarchs, and essentially throwing these massive block parties of freedom. But by the last quarter of the century, nationalism morphed into this narrow creed with super limited ends. Our neighborhood analogy, it mutated. It went from a community supporting each other to, well, a hostile gang trying to conquer the other neighborhoods. These nationalist groups became incredibly intolerant of one another, and they were just constantly ready to go to war to prove their superiority.
That brings us to Section 2, the Balkan powder keg.
Now, to see exactly where this new toxic brand of nationalism first exploded, we've got to look at the Balkans. After 1871, this was absolutely the most serious source of nationalist tension in all of Europe. We're talking about a massive geographical scale here and just intense ethnic variation. To put it in perspective, today this region makes up Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, Macedonia, Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Slovenia, Serbia, and Montenegro. Back then, the inhabitants were broadly grouped together as the Slavs. And to give you an idea of the staggering diversity here, because this really surprises a lot of people, you could travel just a few miles over a mountain pass in this era and find entirely different languages, totally different religions, even different alphabets being used. It was this vast, complicated tapestry of cultures packed right into one mountainous region.
Now, for a long time, a huge chunk of the Balkans was under the thumb of the Ottoman Empire. Throughout the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire really tried to strengthen itself through modernization and internal reforms, but they honestly had very little success. Imagine this giant, aging structure just slowly, painfully crumbling. So, you take the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and you combine it with the rapid spread of those romantic nationalist ideas we just talked about, and boom, the region becomes highly explosive. One by one, its European subject nationalities just started breaking away from its control and declaring their independence.
But how did they justify breaking away? Well, they used history as a weapon. The Balkan peoples based their claims for independence strictly on nationality. They basically pointed to the past to prove, hey, we were once independent, but we were subjugated by foreign powers. So they framed these rebellions as attempts to win back their long-lost freedom. But here is the tragic flaw in all of this. As these different Slavic nationalities struggled to figure out their own identity, they became fiercely jealous of each other. Every single new state hoped to grab more territory completely at the expense of its neighbors.
Which leads into Section 3, big power rivalries.
You see, this intense regional jealousy, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It drew the attention of some massive global empires. The situation in the Balkans got infinitely more complicated because it turned into a theater for big power rivalries. At this time, Europe's heavyweights, Russia, Germany, England, and Austro-Hungary, were locked in this intense multi-step competition. Step 1, a fierce rivalry for global trade and colonies. Step 2, a massive arms race for naval and military might, just to protect that trade. And Step 3, countering any rival's control in the Balkans. Every single one of these powers wanted to swoop in and extend their own control over the area. They were essentially pouring gallons of gasoline on the Balkan fire just to expand their own imperial power. So let's summarize that real quick. Why exactly did nationalist tensions emerge in the Balkans? Well, it was a deadly combination, right? From the inside, you've got the total collapse of the Ottoman Empire, mixed with romantic nationalism and bitter territorial jealousy among the Slavic states. And then from the outside, you have the heavy-handed imperialism of Russia, Germany, England, and Austro-Hungary trying to manipulate everything. Honestly, it was a recipe for absolute disaster.
Moving right along to Section 4, visualizing the empire.
Let's pivot for a second and look at an actual historical artifact that really reveals the imperialist mindset of this era. But first, let's anchor ourselves chronologically. In 1871, that Balkan tension officially rises up as the most serious threat in Europe. Fast forward a bit to 1886, right at the height of this global competition, and we see these grand, lavish celebrations of empire, like in Britain. And ultimately, this unbroken chain of events leads us directly to 1914, when Europe is completely plunged into disaster. Let's zero in on that middle date, though, 1886, to see exactly how these empires viewed themselves.
Now, what's truly fascinating about this historical artifact we're examining, an actual original map from 1886 celebrating the British Empire, is the sheer scale of the propaganda. As a historian, looking at a primary source like this, you don't just look at the geography, you're looking at the message being broadcasted. The major European powers were actively manipulating the nationalist aspirations of subject peoples to further their own imperialist aims. And this map, it is the visual embodiment of that imperial pride. Just look closely at the details depicted here. Up at the top, you see angels literally carrying the banner of freedom. Right in the foreground, there's Britannia, the symbol of the British nation, triumphantly sitting over the globe. But then look at how the colonies are represented. They're shown through images of tigers, elephants, forest, and primitive people. The philosophical irony here is just staggering. Imperialism framed world domination and the literal subjugation of other human beings as the very foundation of Britain's national pride and freedom. I mean, they celebrated controlling others as their own national triumph, which, historically speaking, is just some top-tier mental gymnastics. Let's look at Section 5, Disaster in 1914. And this brings our chronological narrative to its absolute devastating climax. These major European powers, they played a really dangerous game, and they completely lost control of it. That series of localized wars in the Balkan region, it snowballed and culminated in the First World War. Nationalism, firmly aligned with imperialism, led Europe to absolute disaster in 1914. You remember that conquering gang mentality we talked about earlier? Well, this was its ultimate tragic result. Millions of lives were lost, all because the idealistic, bloc party dreams of the early 1800s had been violently twisted into tools for global domination. Finally, Section 6, the anti-imperialist wave. But, the story doesn't just end with European destruction. We have to look at the global aftermath, specifically how the subjugated colonies responded. Because meanwhile, countries all over the world that had been colonized by European powers began to actively oppose that imperial domination. The anti-imperial movements that started springing up everywhere were nationalist for sure, but in a totally different way than that late European model. While European imperialism was hyper-focused on domination, these global movements were inspired by a sense of collective national unity, forged specifically in confrontation with imperialism. They simply wanted to form independent nation-states. So European ideas of nationalism were nowhere replicated exactly. Instead, people everywhere developed their own unique, specific varieties of nationalism, just to win back their freedom. So, the crucial point here, the big takeaway from this era is this. The idea that society should be organized into nation-states came to be accepted as natural and universal. Even though the anti-imperialists totally rejected European domination, they embraced the core concept of the nation-state itself. And that shift, that marked the birth of the modern political map exactly as we know it today. As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought, pulling right from a project prompt in the text. We just analyzed that British map, right, with Britannia and the angels and all that. But what about the rest of the world? If you were to look into nationalist symbols, like pictures, posters, or even music, in countries outside of Europe, how are they different? How did nations in Asia, Africa, or the Americas visually represent their own unique struggles for independence? Exploring that is going to show you just how adaptable and incredibly powerful the idea of a nation truly is. Think about that for a bit, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the maps.